How many of you sitting at this table have opened a small business and operated it for more than a decade? I got you down there, Don. How many of you have worked back in rural districts in a small business?
I've worked in one, but I haven't founded one.
You haven't founded one, so yeah, all right. So the reason I'm asking that question is that we're talking about some really big stuff here, okay? And there's a lot of room for debate on that. But I want to go back to what works and what's not working in our small business community right now. Inflationary pressures are incredible. Regulatory burdens and how they are enforced in a very prescriptive manner are crushing to the small business community. These are businesses that are innovating. These are businesses that are creating jobs, and this is where the next great idea always comes from, is somebody's small business in a garage. Okay, and what we keep doing with a lot of these policies is making our economy bigger in terms of the participants in the economy versus making it work for smaller businesses, and particularly those in rural areas. So I want to really emphasize how important it is right now that we form this debt commission and where we work in a bipartisan manner to really get to a really good set of facts that we can then begin to make really good decisions on. We argue all the time about this policy's better, that policy's better. I'm gonna give you one example. How many of you think that we should be making decisions on the CBO score? The Congressional Budget Office scoring of when we do policy, how many of you think that we should actually be using that number as the basis for our decision? Okay, it is wildly wrong. If you take a CBO score and go out 10 years, it's wrong every time in their 10-year estimate, almost every single time. They use static scoring instead of dynamic scoring. Let me give you a perfect example. On paper, if you look at the Affordable Care Act, it said that we would have better access, better utilization, better outcomes, and lower cost. Well, let's look at where we are based off of CBO scoring. The first question is America healthier now than it was a decade ago? The answer is no. Are costs up or down? Costs are up. We may have better access, but do we have better utilization of the system? The answer is no. If you look at the CBO scoring as it relates to the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, how many we had greater than expected revenues coming in from that. Does anybody argue with that?
I think that's not right.
You don't think it's right. So
No,
we have record revenues coming in.
No.
Okay.
Last year's revenues were 16.5% of GDP. It's worth noting, yes, of course, in the year before that, there was a record year, but that was, as my colleague noted, kind of an aberration. 16.5% of GDP was the revenue. That's one of the lowest in recent history. In 2000, before the Bush tax cuts and the Trump tax cuts,
how do you factor in inflation into the GDP? Does that skew it at all?
No, it doesn't, because it's the nominal amount of revenue raised divided by the nominal GDP. It's 16.5%.
All right. Dr. Faulkner, do you think that we should be doing things from a business standpoint that encourage investment here domestically, that encourage research and development here domestically, and do you think we should make every effort to transfer wealth from around the world to the U.S.?
I think we should be creating a business environment that is competitive globally, and so this is where I'm going to just greatly disagree with some of the other panelists, because if you look at the pre-TCJA world, if you operated a business here in the United States, you contemporaneously paid a 35% corporate income tax rate. In TCJA, we brought that down to 21%. If you operate a multinational, you were able to essentially, especially if you're a significant intellectual property firm, you're able to move the royalties from intellectual property over to a tax haven country and essentially avoid corporate income tax on it. And so by implementing GILTI, we took the tax rate on foreign IP profits from essentially 0 up to 11%. So it seems to me that prior to TCJA, it was 35 for a small company located here in the United States or a domestic company doing something here versus essentially 0. Instead of 35 versus 0, it went to 21 versus 11. That encouraged domestic activity, not discouraged.
Mr. Chairman, may I make one, I know my time has expired, may I make ask one more question? We're in this battle right now. If you're running a business, particularly a small business, there is limited revenue stream, okay? You can do elastic pricing models, you can raise prices to a certain point, but then consumers cannot afford that. You've got to create headroom in there for a business to operate, to be creative, to take risks, to make investments. Would anybody on this panel, if the answer is raising taxes, would you simultaneously be willing to greatly reduce the regulatory burden, not necessarily the goals of what you want the regulation to be, but the prescriptive nature in which those regulations are applied to multinationals as well as small businesses?
I think there's room for streamlining some regulations, but I wouldn't take them to zero. I think they serve a very useful purpose in some.
But
But there's room to streamline. Yeah.
thank you. Thank you for your indulgence, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.